And we had gone the past 3 weeks. We went through Philippians chapter 4, verse 1 through 9. We did Philippians chapter, we zoomed in on Philippians chapter 4, verse 6 through 8. And then we went into Philippians chapter 4, verse 8, just so we could get the rich material found in there, all about prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, so we can make our requests known to God based on what God's will and what God's doing today, and how we can think and operate in the dispensation of grace. And so we saw this through verse 6, verse 7, verse 8. And then we saw 3 weeks ago about verse 9, how to have Paul as their pattern. And then we jump in now to verse 10. And it says, we'll read verse 9 again. Those things which ye have both learned and received and heard and seen in me do, and the God of peace shall be with you. He says, but I rejoiced in the Lord greatly. But now at the last your care of me hath flourished again, wherein ye were also careful, but ye lacked opportunity. He goes on to say this here, and we see this in verse 10 as Paul writes to the Philippians. He says that here, he says, but I rejoiced in the Lord greatly, saying this here about his rejoicing. And this is the last time you see about rejoicing. But this is like the fourth time. This is the fourth time you see the word rejoice coming up in this epistle as it comes up over and over again. Paul's in jail rejoicing greatly. He's telling the Philippians to rejoice in the Lord. And in the previous 2 times, he's also talking to the Philippians about rejoicing. And constantly, in this life that we walk in, he tells them twice before Philippians chapter 3, rejoice, rejoice. And then we see it in Philippians chapter 3, rejoice in the Lord. And again, I say rejoice. We see it also in, I believe it's Philippians 4:4. Rejoice in the Lord always. And again, I say rejoice. And now we're seeing it in Philippians 4:10. Saying, but I rejoice in the Lord greatly. So we see this coming up over and over again in Philippians. So it's a theme going along with unity, going along with this group that needs to be further, so experience a little further growth and unity. And then he says that now at the last, your care of me hath flourished again. And so there was a time where they were making sure to take care of Paul. Then for some reason, one way or another, it stopped. And then he says why. He says here, wherein ye were also careful, but ye lacked opportunity. The reason why it stopped was that they lacked the opportunity to continue to help. It's not that they hated Paul, they didn't want to help Paul, or they chose to save their possessions to help. It's that they lacked the opportunity to help. And if we look at 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 9, if we remember that part when we were doing 2 Corinthians verse by verse, it was a while back. Maybe a couple months ago or so. 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 9. What we had reviewed, or what we had gone over, was when the poor saints at Jerusalem, Paul went around taking a contribution for them, and he went to all the believers in Macedonia. And we had seen that he had gone to not only Philippi, but he had also gone to Berea, he had also gone to Thessalonica, asking for assistance. And they gave willingly. We see here in verse 9, it says, and when I was present with you and wanted, I was chargeable to no man. For that which was lacking to me, the brethren which came from Macedonia supplied. And that big area of Macedonia was Philippi, which is the Philippians we're looking at here. And there's also Thessalonica, and there's Berea, and there's a couple of other spots in there. But he's saying, which came from Macedonia supplied, and in all things I have kept myself from being burdensome unto you, in this case Corinthians, and so will I keep myself. So he mentions this here, that all these saints from the area of Macedonia are helping out, and this is where we read in the 2 Corinthians, he's saying, all right, Corinthians, you said you were going to help, so don't just say it, actually do it. We covered that a couple months ago when we were in 2 Corinthians. As we come into where we are with Philippians, we're seeing here in verse 10, he says, but I rejoice in the Lord greatly that now at the last your care of me hath flourished again. And so he's mentioning this, talking about not only as they assist with the poor saints in Jerusalem, this issue where we read about in 2 Corinthians 11, which also goes all the way back to Romans chapter 16. But you also see this here in what we're looking at here, where he says that your care of me hath flourished again, wherein ye were also careful, but ye lacked opportunity. And so we're seeing that they had lacked the opportunity to also help Paul while he was in jail. And so as they're also helping out the poor saints in Jerusalem, they're also helping Paul, who they heard was in bonds or in jail. So they're also, all these saints in Macedonia are constantly helping them out with their contributions and with their assistance. So Paul, as we had studied in earlier chapters in the book of Philippians, he's also making sure that the Christ is being preached 6 different ways. Everyone's rejoicing in the Lord. Paul's rejoicing in the Lord. And at the same time, he's receiving assistance from people, all while he's in jail. There's a lot going on that Paul has happening in the body of Christ while Paul's just in jail. So there's a lot that that Paul is making happen while he's in jail. So much less when he's out there on the scene. So we see this happening here in verse 10. He says that wherein you were also careful, but you lacked opportunity. And so they had lacked the opportunity to help out, but now it's flourishing again, is what he's saying here. If you look at, say, Galatians chapter 6, verse 10, this is kind of where Paul goes with this. And he writes this to the Galatians as far as practical instruction and with doctrinal information. He says in Galatians chapter 6, verse 10, he goes on and tells the Galatians, even with them, he tells them, here he says, let's see if I can get there. Talk about lacking opportunity and so on and so forth. He says, as we have therefore opportunity, and there's an opportunity we're cross-referring it all to, let us do good unto all men, especially unto them who are of the household of faith. We may not always have the opportunity that we need, but when we do have the opportunity, as Paul says to the Galatians, then let us do good unto all men, especially unto them who are of the household of faith. So he mentions this here to Galatians, and this is where it's coming into where we're at with the Philippians. He mentions that here to them, and both churches are edified accordingly. So we see this in Philippians chapter 4, verse 10. He goes on and he says something profound here in verse 11, 12, and 13. And this is where we're going to get most of where we're going to. Because he says in verse 11, he says, not that I speak in respect of want, for I have learned in whatsoever state I am, therewith to be content. There's David. He says, I know both how to be abased and I know how to abound. Everywhere and in all things I am instructed both to be full and to be hungry, both to abound and to suffer need. And then the most famous verse that gets misused everywhere you go, I can do all things through Christ which strengtheneth me. So as we back up and we look at where we are, in verse 11 he's going on to say, not that I speak in respect of want. So as he's going on and he's saying this is based on what we just went through in verse 10. He's saying here that based on the fact that the care of the Philippians in helping him out in their contribution, whether it's cross-referred back to 2 Corinthians 11, verse 9, or whether it's referred back to anything, the fact that they're assisting him while he's in bonds, he's saying, I'm not speaking in respect of want. In verse 11, that's how he's starting out. It's not about what he wants. He's not looking to have anything. He's not actually going out there asking, please give me this, please give me that. Every church in town is going around asking, please give me this, please give me that. We're looking for a new softball team. We're looking for a new basketball court. We're looking for a new smoke machine to put in the middle of the church. Please give me your money. Please give me a donation. We're going to pass around another plate today. That's what every church in town is doing. That's not what Paul was doing here. Paul's even saying, I don't even speak in respect of what. They're doing this cheerfully and from their heart. And that's what we saw in 2 Corinthians 9. But what we're seeing here in verse 11, he says, not that I speak in respect of one. He says, for I have learned that whatsoever state I am therewith to be content. And as he says this in verse 11, he's going on to make it a point to let him know that whatever, and as you look up in the dictionary the word state, just so you can plug in some synonyms that go with the word state, it has to go with your shape, your condition, or your situation. And as he says this here, he says, not that I speak in respect of one, for I have learned in whatsoever state or shape or condition or situation he's in, therewith to be content. And so he's saying he says, for I have learned. So Paul didn't just, it wasn't a zap and he knew it in 1 second. He had to go through the motions, so to speak. He had to go through the school of hard knocks, for lack of a better phrase to plug it into. And he had to learn that this is what God is and this is what God is not doing today. That whatsoever state he's in, therewith to be content. And so as he says this from jail, as he's helping Christ being preached 6 different ways, as he's receiving gifts, and as he's trying to get this Philippian church unified from jail, in bonds, he knows that no matter what happens, as he's doing multiple things, he's multitasking from jail, that he is therewith to be content no matter what happens. And so the issue is that he's there to be content. If you look for an example, we'll let the Bible be its own dictionary. Luke chapter 3, verse 14. And in Luke chapter 3, verse 14, we'll get another definition of that idea of contentment. And what we'll see there, he's not thankful based on when he receives something for his need. He's thankful regardless if he gets something or not. Luke chapter 3, verse 14. Goes on to read, as we let the Bible be its own dictionary and we plug things back in just to get a better definition, it says, and the soldiers likewise demanded of him, saying, and what shall we do? And he said unto them, do violence to no man, and neither accuse any falsely, and be content with your wages. Be content. You accept it, accepting what the wages are. In this case, this is what they're teaching the soldiers here. But he says this here as far as contentment goes. And so we see that there, and to be contentment, thankful. So, and he says, whatsoever state I'm in, therewith to be content. And we're seeing this from Philippians 4:11. So he's saying, not that I speak in respect of want, for I have learned, in whatsoever state I am, therewith to be content. So Paul's essentially saying, whether I'm sick or whether I'm healthy, or whether I'm happy, whether I'm, whatever's going on, whether I'm in jail, whether I'm free, or whether I'm rich, or whether I'm poor, whether you'll not hear this from Oral Roberts. You won't hear this from the Charismatics. You won't hear this from the Pentecostals. You won't hear this from Kenneth Copeland. You won't hear this from Joyce Meyer, that whatsoever state I'm in, therewith to be content. They're saying that you need to be healthy, you need to be wealthy, you need to be, and you need God to do it for you. So they're going to twist and alter the verses, saying that if you're not healthy, if you're not wealthy, you got a problem. That God is punishing you for certain sins or certain issues or certain whatever it may be. And of course you're at fault. They're not at fault. You're at fault. You're always the bad one. They're always the sinless one. They're floating off to join the Trinity. You're the bad guy. So they're the ones who are perfect, and of course they're going to pass around the plate again. And you're the one that's at fault. And so you need to keep getting on your knees and begging and crying and so on and so forth for God to bless you and give you health and wealth. But actually, we're seeing Paul in jail saying here in verse 11, not that I speak in respect of want, for I have learned in whatsoever state I'm in, therewith to be content. So there's not a certain state where you reach as far as, certain lifestyle, so to speak, a certain dollar sign or health issue. You can serve the Lord and be content, whatever your health state of health is, or state of whatsoever state you're in. And it was the point of what Paul's saying here in verse 11. And as we see that here, and we can continue on with that, he says here in verse 12, adding on to verse 11, he says that I know both how to be abased and I know how to abound. Everywhere and in all things I am instructed, both to be full and to be hungry, both to abound and to suffer need. So he's building on verse 12 from what he said in verse 11. He's saying, I know both how to be abased and I know how to abound. And that's how he's starting out verse 12. Verse 12 is where he's going with this. But when he says, he says, I know how to be abased. Let's go into, again, 2 Corinthians chapter 11. But instead of looking up at verse 9, let's go into verse 23. And when Paul says he's abased, he was abased. As in he was thrown into the basement. And there's where you're getting this term from. And let's see how abased Paul got in his life, in his ministry, in his service to the Lord. 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 23, Paul says, he says from Philippians, I know how to be abased. He says, as we look at the second part of that, he says, in stripes above measure, the latter part of verse 23, and stripes above measure, and prison more frequent, and deaths oft. We're seeing the prison part in Philippians. Of the Jews 5 times received I 40 stripes, save one. Thrice was I beaten with rods, once was I stoned, thrice I suffered shipwreck. A night and the day have I been in the deep, in journeyings often, and perils of waters, and perils of robbers, and perils by mine own countrymen, and perils by the heathen, and perils in the city, and perils in the wilderness, and perils in the sea, and perils among false brethren, and weariness, and painfulness, and watchings often, and hunger and thirst, and fastings often, and cold and nakedness. Goes on from there, but you're seeing him talk about these things. And then, of course, as you bring it back to Philippians 4:12, what he's saying is, I know how to do this. He's saying, I know how to be this. I know how to be abased. He's saying, I can be these things and keep going. I can be these things and know that I'm saved, I'm sealed, I have all spiritual blessings in heavenly places while these things are happening. I'm still a saint. I'm still just as saved as anyone else who's saved. And that this is the norm of living in a sin-cursed world. Galatians 1:4, Romans 8:18, that this is just the norm of what goes on. And so we see this here in verse 12. I know how to be abased and I know how to abound. We see the latter part, everywhere and in all things. So everywhere, literally, and in all things, literally. I am instructed, and of course he's instructed by the Lord Jesus Christ as he's received multiple revelations, both to be full and to be hungry. So there's going to be, as we saw about the fastings part, the only part where you read about fastings in Paul's epistles is when he's hungry. He doesn't fast in order to be more spiritual. He doesn't fast in order to get more blessings. Paul doesn't fast in order to exorcise devils or demons or whatever you want to call it. The word demon's not even in your King James Bible. Paul is saying in Philippians 4:12, he says, I know both how to be abased and I know how to abound. Everywhere and in all things I'm instructed, both to be full and to be hungry, both to abound and to suffer need. So we're knowing that as we see this in Philippians 4:12, we know that the charismatics and the Pentecostals, as they seek for health and wealth, Paul's doing the exact opposite. And we're seeing that he's saying that he's instructed both to be full. So it's okay when Paul receives a lot. When he receives those contributions from the saints in Macedonia, and he receives contributions from not only the Philippians, but the Bereans and the Thessalonians, it's okay to be full. And it's okay to receive what he needs to receive, and he can go forth with it. He can take it and disperse it out as he needs to the poor saints in Jerusalem. That's Romans 16 and 2 Corinthians 11, verse 9. He can disperse it out as needed. He can take what he needs for himself. He can do what he needs to do, but he knows he's not going to be burdensome to anybody. He can also say in verse 12 that he can also be hungry. If he receives nothing for days at a time, he knows that's when he's going to start fasting. He's not fasting to exorcise any devils. He's fasting because there's no food in front of him. And that's the only time you see the word fasting in Paul's epistles. And today, that's the only purpose fasting serves, is if you're doing anything regarding health matters. If they say just fast before you come into the doctor's office, don't eat for 10 blood work, 10 hours, 12 hours. That's the only time fasting occurs for a Christian today. If you need to fast to exorcise the devil, you're in the wrong dispensation, you're in the wrong part of your Bible. So we see that in verse 12. It says, both to be full and to be hungry, both to abound and to suffer need. Paul says he suffers. As a Christian, he suffers more and he suffers need. And yet, as he suffers need, he knows he's saved, he's sealed, he has all spiritual blessings in heavenly places. Ephesians 1:3, he's sealed with the Holy Ghost. Ephesians 1:13, he's a saint of the Most High God, and he's headed for heavenly places, irregardless of the circumstances around him. So he's talking specifically here that as he goes through this, he's not looking for total health and total wealth. He's saying the opposite. He's saying, irregardless of what comes, service to the Lord comes first. And he's going to do this irregardless of the circumstances that comes his way. He says this from jail. So he's saying this here in verse 12. And so he's saying that he knows how to be that as far as abased or abounding, one or the other. And when he talks about abounding or otherwise, he says, I know how to be that. I know how to abound. I know how to be abased. So we're seeing But both, no matter what occurs, either one is fine. So whether he lives in a mansion for the rest of his life or whether he lives under a bridge, both is fine. Whether he has food every day to the full or whether he starves for the rest of the day, both is fine, as long as he understands what his purpose is. Serving the Lord, rightly dividing the word of truth, operating in the fullness of right doctrine. And he knows that. He's the pattern. 1 Timothy 1:16, he's the pattern for all. So he says this from verse 11, 12, and this is where it plugs into verse 13. And the way it says it is, I can do all things, which is being abased and being abounding, and verse 11 and so forth. He can be full and he can be hungry and he can abound and he can suffer, and he can do all things as far as either one on the scale there. And he can do all things through Christ, which strengtheneth him. And in order to understand that, we have to go to Ephesians chapter 3, verse 16. And Ephesians chapter 3, verse 16 shows where the strength comes from, where it goes to. Ephesians chapter 3, verse 16, Paul prays for the Ephesians, and Paul talks and writes to them. And he says that he would grant you, according to the riches of his glory, to be strengthened. And there's that strength that Christ has strengthened me. To be strengthened with might by his Spirit in the inner man, that Christ may dwell in your hearts by faith, that ye, being rooted and grounded in love, may be able to comprehend with all saints what is the breadth and length and depth and height. And it goes on from there. But verse 16 is where we're zooming in on, what we're looking at. He says that he would grant you, according to the riches of his glory, to be strengthened with might by his Spirit in the inner man. So we don't have our inner man, and we're looking for it to be, once we're saved and we come to the knowledge of the truth, we're looking for it to get strengthened, because our outer man, as we get older and as we go through this life, it gets weaker and weaker, the outer man. The inner man is how we're looking to get stronger and stronger through right doctrine, through right information, through the truth of the Bible rightly divided, 2 Timothy 2:15. And as we get our inner man strengthened through truth of God's word rightly divided, we no longer conform to this world, but we conform to right doctrine through what Jesus Christ would have us to know. So we see that in verse 16, that we would be strengthened with might by his Spirit. Of course, then you say, well, by his Spirit, is it like a zap or some sort of experience we're supposed to experience? But no, the by his Spirit part is 2 Timothy 3:16. And if we go there, 2 Timothy 3:16 goes on to say this about the scriptures. And it goes on to say, all scripture is given by inspiration of God. And so we're seeing that inspiration of God. We have here a book that is Holy Spirit inspired. It's inspiration of God. And so as we have the inspiration of God, words, this book that is inspired by God, we have it work in our inner man as we study.
My tablet. You can use the tablet.
As we study it and we read it and we put it into our inner man, we rightly divide it and allow it to be the truth that we put into our inner man. And we know that it's profitable for doctrine, for reproof, for correction, for instruction in righteousness, that the man of God may be perfect, fully furnished unto all good works. So we know this as we bring it back to where we are. So as we bring it to Philippians chapter 4, Philippians chapter 4, what we're going to see here as we bring it back. Let's see. Let me see if we can find that there. We have let's put all of our cell phones and all of our computers, we can put them on mute.
The plots, any position you can apply to, just get in. In after 6 months, you can move around.
Let's go. So Philippians chapter 4. I don't know if you can. Let's see. We'll see. He says in verse 13. I can do all things through Christ, which strengtheneth me. That's how the strengthening happens. As we study and have his word work effectually in us, as we rightly divide the word of truth, it'll work into our inner man. We'll be strengthened as we go forth with the word of truth. And it won't matter if we abound or if we suffer need. Those things are what bothers those that are lost, in which we can go forth, because we're focused on things above. Colossians 3:1-4. And we can go forth understanding things above, not on things on the earth. And therefore, we can do all things through Christ who strengtheneth us. And the lost are more focused on it, is what I should say. They're more focused on, whether they got the new car, whether they get the new job, that kind of thing. We're more focused on service, and we're more focused on not being conformed to these things. So we see that there. But we still, time to time, we get focused on these things, accidentally. We just get back in the Word. We just keep going. We just keep pressing on. It happens to all of us. So we see that in verse 13 and verse 14. Notwithstanding, ye have well done that ye did communicate with my affliction. So Paul goes on to say to the Philippians that notwithstanding, ye have well done that ye did communicate with my affliction. So if you go back to Philippians chapter 1, verse 7, which we have previously studied, and we'll see even in Philippians chapter 1, verse 7, he had talked about how they had communicated with his affliction, him being in jail. And we see here, he says, notwithstanding, ye have well done that ye did communicate with him being in jail with my affliction. Philippians 1:7 went on to say that even as it is meet for me to think this of you all, because I have you in my heart, inasmuch as both in my bonds and in the defense and confirmation of the gospel, you're all partakers of my grace. And so there's so much as that they communicate with him while he's in jail. They're partakers of him, as if they were in jail with him. So they support him and they help him, and they do what they can to be there for him, with him, as if they were. We see that in verse 14. And if we look also at 1 Timothy 6:18, Paul was telling Timothy much of the same that he was telling the Philippians. 1 Timothy 6:18 tells them they're supposed to communicate, even regardless of the circumstances, whether they're in jail, whether they're not in jail. He says in 1 Timothy 6:18 that they're supposed to do good. And that was the first part. It says that they do good, that they be rich in good works, ready to distribute, willing to communicate. And so as they were willing to communicate, Paul says that that's what they did. And it was a good thing that they did, that they communicate with his affliction, especially with his affliction. But the communication did take place, and that was the good thing that they had done. And even if we look at Romans chapter 12 and verse 15. And in Romans 12:15, as Paul goes on talking about how they did communicate with his affliction, him being in jail, they communicated, they supported him, they helped him. And the Philippians, all the saints in Macedonia did a great job with this. He says pretty much we see an instruction here, rejoice with them that do rejoice and weep with them that weep, and be of the same mind one toward another. And mind not high things, but condescend to men of low estate, and be not wise in your own conceits. So we see in that part where Paul is telling the Philippians, especially in verse 16, be of the same mind one toward another. This is what he's especially trying to drive home in Philippians all throughout the book, 2, 3, and 4. But he says, mind not high things, condescend to men of low estate. Paul is being in prison for doing nothing wrong. That's a pretty low estate to be in there. So he says this in verse 14. Notwithstanding, ye have done well, or well done, that ye did communicate with my affliction. And he makes that known to them. So they share with Paul's present affliction in prison or in bonds from where they were by contribution. And he makes that known to them. So we see that here, and then all throughout what we were seeing, in verse 11, 12, and 13, how someone responds to whatever's going on is more important than what's actually going on in the first place. So the fact that Paul's in jail, or the fact that there's issues going on, that they're trying to help the poor, or there's a health issue or a matter that's going on, how someone responds is going to be better for the grace age believer, or the saint in Christ today, than the actual thing that's going on itself. And that's the doctrine working in them. So we can know this, or they can know this, and the doctrine can work effectually in them. So we see this in verse 11, 12, 13, and here we are in 14. And so as Paul goes on in verse 15, what he goes on to say here is, now ye Philippians know also that in the beginning of the gospel, when I departed from Macedonia, that area that they're in, And he says, no church communicated with me as concerning giving and receiving, but ye only. And so he's making a point to let them know they did a great job in the giving and receiving process of contribution, because they did it cheerfully, they did it willingly. Paul's not, as we had said earlier, you won't hear this in probably any church in your town. They intentionally pass around a plate saying, we need you to tithe, we need you to give. There is no such thing today as tithing. There's no such thing. You give what you want to give, when you want to give it. If you want to give nothing, you give nothing, and it's fine. If you want to give everything, you give everything, and that's fine. And the person who gives everything is equal as the same person who gives nothing. That's just how that is, and that's how that operates. If that's foreign, you may be used to giving 10%. That's even the idea of tithing. That's they gave crops, they gave livestock, they gave different things. That's in Deuteronomy. So that's not going to be, I believe it's Deuteronomy 14. You don't give money, you give crops. So the next time someone gives you a check for your tithe, put some crops in there. Put some, put a piece of meat in there, put a piece of livestock in there, and send that up and see what they say. So we see that there. But in verse 15, he says, now ye Philippians know also that in the beginning of the gospel. So when he's saying in the beginning of the gospel, he's talking about when Paul went out and preached the gospel. Paul's always been preaching the same gospel. Paul never preached the gospel of the kingdom that Peter, the apostle Peter, the apostle James, and the apostle John preached. He preached the gospel of the grace of God, Acts 20:24, 1 Corinthians 15:1-4. And he says, at the beginning of the gospel, when I departed from Macedonia, and we know that he did just that, he says that, and he departed from Macedonia, no church communicated with me. Now, when he says no church, don't think of a building, think of a group of saved believers. And in Macedonia, as we saw before, the churches were Thessalonica, they were Berea, or the Bereans, Acts 17:11, and the Philippians. And he's saying, no church communicated with me as concerning giving and receiving, but ye only. You can also read more about that in Acts 11:15, and it just goes on from there. So he's mentioning all these things to them, and he's saying what a great job they did, and as far as helping them out. So he mentions this here. And as he continues on, he says in verse 16, as he presses on and continues, he says, for even in Thessalonica, he sent once and again into my necessity. And so even as he had moved on from, as he was moving through the area of Macedonia, and he went into Thessalonica, he says, for even in Thessalonica, he says that he sent once, not just once, but and again, unto my necessity. So as Paul had needs, the Philippians were the ones that kept up the momentum, that kept on charitably giving to Paul. As he had needs, they cheerfully, willingly gave. And they gave not expecting, as if I give $100, God's going to give me 1,000. They didn't give so they could get more back. They gave because it was just the right thing to do. They gave expecting nothing back. And that's what we do today as we give to whatever ministry we give to. We want to give to the ministry that has the right information, the right doctrine, or whatever. We want to give expecting nothing back, but what we're going to present at the judgment seat of Christ one day and say, at the judgment seat of Christ, I gave to this ministry because it had right information, right doctrine, and the reward that you get will be based on that. From 1 Corinthians chapter 3. So we see that there. But in verse 16, it says, for even in Thessalonica, he said once and again. And we can say a little bit about that. If we look at Acts 17, verse 1, I say a little bit about Paul's time in Thessalonica, a little bit of time there that he had spent there. He had had the opportunity to set some churches up there regarding the Thessalonians and so on and so forth. But Acts chapter 17, verse 1, and he goes on to say here, now when they had passed through Amphipolis and Apollonia, they came to Thessalonica, where was the synagogue of the Jews. And Paul, as his manner was, went in unto them, and 3 Sabbath days reasoned with them out of the scriptures, opening and alleging that Christ must needs have suffered and risen again from the dead, and that this Jesus, whom I preach unto you, is Christ. And some of them believed and consorted with Paul and Silas, and of the devout Greeks a great multitude, and of the chief women not a few. But the Jews, which believed not, moved with envy, took unto them certain lewd fellows of the baser sort, and gathered a company, and set all the city on an uproar, and assaulted the house of Jason, and sought to bring them out to the people. And when they found them not, they drew Jason and certain brethren unto the rulers of the city, crying, These that have turned the world upside down are come hither also, whom Jason hath received, and these all do contrary to the decrees of Caesar, saying that there is another king, one Jesus. And they troubled the people and the rulers of the city when they heard these things. And when they had taken security of Jason and of the other, they let them go. So we see a little bit about this when Paul had spent time in Thessalonica. He could have been there for weeks, maybe months, but he probably got some churches set up around that time. But that brings it back to verse 16. For even in Thessalonica, he said once and again unto my necessity. As he was in that time working around in that place, the Philippians were most likely helping him out. As he had need, they contributed to his need. And as we had studied before, I believe it was in 2 Corinthians, there was no cell phone, there was no computers where he just typed, say, hey, I need this, and it was over there in 24 hours. He would just literally write something down, and somebody would walk it over to a group, and however long it took for them to get it to a group, then they would take the time to gather it up. Someone would walk it over there. Hopefully there's no robbers, there's no animals that would, eat the food. And however long that took, that's, and they wouldn't set up a meeting place. They would just say, I'm here in Thessalonica. They'd have to find them. And, whatever happened, happened. And so that was, and it all worked out, but that's how they did it. So we see that in verse 16. And so he mentions this here. I believe in 2 Thessalonians 2, verse 1 also mentions a little bit more. A detail or two more comes up. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 1. Let me see if I got that right. Might have the wrong, maybe first, I always do that. 1 Thessalonians 2, yeah, 1 Thessalonians 2, verse 1. Just a little more detail on when he was in Thessalonica. And he says, for yourselves, brethren, know our entrance in unto you. So he's talking about his entrance when he came into them, came into them, that it was not in vain. For even after that we had suffered before and were shamefully entreated, as ye know, at Philippi, we were bold in our God to speak unto you the gospel of God with much contention. So he talks about his trip from Philippi to Thessalonica, because Macedonia is the big area that surrounds all that. So he mentions this here in 1 Thessalonians 2, verse 1 and 2, the connection between the two areas. So just more details to plug it all in together. But we see that in verse 16 as he goes through this. And then as he talks about this, writing to the Philippians, talking about how important all this is, the sacrifice and everything else that goes with what he's saying to them. We see here in verse 17, the whole reason of all this. He says, not because I desire a gift, but I desire fruit that may abound to your account. So as he says this fruit that may abound to your account, he's saying that not because I desire a gift. It's the same thing we had looked at a little bit earlier. He had said in verse 11, as we saw this before, not that I speak in respect of want. And so he had said this, that he's saying this, that he's not speaking in respect of what he wants. Paul's not saying, guys, I want this, and every church in town says, we need a new basketball court, we need a new smoke. That we had talked about this a little bit earlier. And he's saying, not because I desire a gift. Paul's not saying, please, Philippians, gimme, gimme, gimme. You'll hear a lot of churches say, gimme, gimme, gimme. I need your tithe. I need your money. I need your this. I need your, I want, I need. Paul's saying, give what you want. Cheerfully give as you see fit. I'm heading out to the Philippians, or I'm heading out to the Thessalonians. Give as you see fit. Give what you need. And this is how he goes with this. You'll rarely hear churches do that. And sometimes Paul wouldn't even say, give. He just wouldn't say, they would know that Paul would be heading out, and they would recognize the need and give as they would. So we see that in verse 17, not because I desire a gift. Paul didn't desire us for anything like that. He says, but I desire fruit that may abound to your account. And so we see a little bit about this here. And if we look at Titus chapter 3, verse 14, what Paul is talking about here in Titus 3:14, he's looking to make sure that they do have good works for necessary uses. And what he says here in Titus 3:14, he says, and let ours also learn to maintain good works for necessary uses, that they be not unfruitful. So it's going to be fruitful, in which, as he says here, that they abound to your account. And their account is going to be towards the judgment seat of Christ. And we'll spend a little more time. Every couple of weeks, we'll have to go back to that and present that again. If you go to 1 Corinthians chapter 3, when we talk about their account, and as they go back to the account of the judgment seat of Christ, when the Philippians go there, and they already have, and the Thessalonians go there, and Paul goes there, and every believer goes there, they're going to have to give an account, for what they gave, who they gave it to, what they trust. And we're talking about believers. We're not talking about unsaved people or heathen or those that are lost. We're talking about believers who trust the right gospel. 1 Corinthians 15, 1-4, who trust Christ has died for all their sins, and that what he did was fully sufficient to pay for their sins, past, present, and future, all of their sins. So we see in 1 Corinthians 3, verse 9, Paul said to the Corinthians, for we are laborers together with God, ye are God's husbandry, ye are God's building. It says, according to the grace of God, which is given unto me as a wise master builder, I have laid the foundation, and another buildeth thereon. So Paul lays the foundation, and it says, but every man take heed how he buildeth thereupon. And he talks about what the foundation is in verse 11. For other foundation can no man lay than that is laid, which is Jesus Christ. Now we know in this dispensation, it's Romans 16, verse 25 and 26. And I'll go there for a second, just to read that out, because we don't want to preach Jesus Christ any way we feel like. And we know in Romans 16, 25 and 26, it says, now to him that is of power to establish you according to my gospel, and the preaching of Jesus Christ according to the revelation of the mystery. So we don't want to go preaching Christ according to Jesus in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, because that's not Jesus Christ according to the revelation of the mystery. People will say, well, I didn't know that. And so they will go and they will preach what Christ was doing in Matthew 5, Matthew 6, Matthew 7, Matthew 24, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And that's not preaching Christ according to the revelation of the mystery. So when you bring it back, and you see Paul saying that the foundation that he lays is Jesus Christ. It's Jesus Christ according to after the cross, not before it. Jesus doesn't die on the cross in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John until the last chapters of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So everything before the cross is, you got some Old Testament going on in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. I'd say about 7/8 is Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And even when you get past the cross in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the New Testament belongs to the same people who get the Old Testament. And you know that through Jeremiah 31, verse 31 through 34. So you've got all Israel going on in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So we know the only time that the body of Christ, believers today, will have Jesus Christ as their foundation is going to be through the Apostle Paul and his epistles. And so that's why he lays the foundation at the judgment seat, which we're all going to face. And he says that in verse 11. For other foundation can no man lay than that is laid, which is Jesus Christ. And he says, now if any man build upon this foundation, in verse 12, gold, silver, precious stones, wood, hay, stubble, that's going to be all about doctrinal information. So we're going to see that there. And we're going to see that wood, hay, stubble is going to be three things you don't want. And gold, silver, and precious stone are three things you do want. It's going to say every man's work shall be made manifest. And as it's going to be made manifest, you see how it's going to be made manifest. It says in verse 13, because it shall be revealed by fire. So at the judgment seat of Christ, you're going to have your works, everything you did once you were saved. You have a fire there, God's purifying fire. your works, whatever that was that you did, whatever ministry you created, whatever works that you did that were supposed to be pleasing to God, go through the fire. And whatever that was Pauline, where Paul had laid the foundation and you built upon Paul's foundation, goes through the fire. And we see there it says, if any man's work in verse 14, if any man's work abide, this is verse 14, which he hath built upon, he shall receive a reward. So if it goes through the fire and it makes it through and it doesn't burn up, then you receive a reward. Verse 15 says, if any man's work shall be burned, he shall suffer loss, but he himself shall be saved, yet so as by fire. So you can go to the judgment seat of Christ, go into heavenly places, judgment seat of Christ, and suffer loss. But it says in verse 15, yet, but he himself shall be saved. You'll still be saved. Christ saved you. Christ saved you, but your works, everything you did, could burn up, and you have nothing to present. Because you can have a healing ministry. You can have a water baptism ministry. But Paul never did any of that. Paul had nothing to do with that. Paul did not associate himself with that once Christ revealed to him the revelation of the mystery. Once Christ revealed to him that was once what was going on, but today we're not doing that. Today, baptism is of the Spirit, and salvation is of Christ crucified. And everything else that has to go with Paul's epistles, but Paul is the one who's laying the foundation. The foundation is Jesus Christ after the cross, as he is ascended into heaven. Right? We're not preaching Christ today according to him going around healing the blind and raising the dead and everything that he did in Israel, because we're not in Israel. This is all about what Christ did once he was in heaven, which was building up the body of Christ, starting the body of Christ. And that's just some of that. So we see a little bit about that there. That's the revelation, the revealing of the mystery. And that's what you read all about in in Romans and Philemon. So we see that here as he talks about this. And so every man's account is where Paul is talking about the Philippians having fruit abounding onto that account, because they're cheerfully giving unto Paul, who is laying the foundation for them. And they're cheerfully giving to Paul, who is helping them out in all that he does. And they're cheerfully giving not only once, but multiple times. As we go back to where we see this in Philippians chapter 4, in verse 17, not because I desire a gift, but I desire fruit that may abound to your account. So he's looking for some gold, silver, and precious stones for the Philippians, because they've been very gracious to him as he's gone out to Thessalonica, to Berea, and everywhere in Macedonia to help build up churches and establish the doctrine and get things going for them. So we see that in verse 17 as Paul continues on with his work, and he's looking to make sure that they have fruit abounding to their account, because that's a good thing to do for another saint. If you know that you get the gospel to somebody, and they already know the gospel, and they kind of tell you in one shape, way, or form or another, they got the gospel down pat. You help them have a better day at the judgment seat of Christ if, say, they have something a little bit off with their doctrine, or they're looking to grow even further in their doctrine. Help them to have an even better day at the judgment seat of Christ. Help them get more gold, silver, and precious stones for the judgment seat of Christ if you know that they've got the gospel down pat. Nothing wrong with that. Let them help you, and let you help them get more gold, silver, and precious stones. Let's all help each other get some treasures of wisdom for the judgment seat of Christ. So, and we know that's only going to be through Jesus Christ, who's the foundation that we know here that Paul lays out. So we see that there. But if we go to 2 Corinthians 9, verse 9, we'll probably start wrapping up here. And we'll open up to questions. 2 Corinthians 9. When he talked about the concept of fruit being given to their account, he had said to them here, talking about the fruits of their righteousness and everything else for the Corinthians, he had said, as it is written, he hath dispersed abroad, he had given to the poor, his righteousness remaineth forever. He talked about this. This was more Psalms 112 that he is cross-referring to, where he says, as it is written. Now he that ministereth seed to the sower, both minister bread for your food, and multiply your seed sown, and increase the fruits of your righteousness. And he says, being enriched in everything to all bountifulness, which causeth to us thanksgiving to God. And so he was talking more about this with the concept of cheerful giving. If you even look up a couple verses from 2 Corinthians 9 and verse 9. Go up to 2 Corinthians 9, verse 6. And this is the concept for grace giving today. It's not about tithing. It's not about giving a certain percentage. It's not 10% or 5% or 100% or 90% or 0%. It's not about any percentage. We see here it says in 2 Corinthians 9, verse 6, it says, but this I say, that he which soweth sparingly shall reap also sparingly, and he which soweth bountifully shall reap also bountifully. Every man according as he purposeth in his heart, so let him give. Not grudgingly or of necessity, for God loveth a cheerful giver. So you don't give grudgingly. So if you're in a church building or a religion or a denomination and they're passing out a plate, and you feel grudgingly like you got to give, like, oh, here comes that plate again, I'll just dump some money in order to shut them up. You're giving grudgingly. You're giving because you hate the fact that they're passing around that stupid plate, so you're going to dump some money in there and get rid of it. Well, you're not giving out of the right heart. You're giving grudgingly. And then you see in verse 7, he says, or of necessity. Or of necessity means that you're going to give money so that God can bless you and heal you and fix you, and God's going to give you everything. If you give $100, God will give you $1,000. If you give $100, God's going to fix your arm and your legs and your children and your house and your spouse and your car and your job and your life. And that doesn't happen either. And so you're trying to give of necessity. You're trying to make God be your butler. You're trying to make God be your servant. You're trying to make God do what you want. You're trying to make God be your genie because you want some things of necessity. And so you're trying to pay him off. And that doesn't work either. And so we see that in verse 7. He says, for God loveth a cheerful giver. You give because you want to. You give because it's the right thing to do. And you know it in your heart. Maybe everyone else doesn't know that. Maybe a couple people do. Maybe some people don't. That's between them and God. But when you give because you're giving cheerfully, because you want to, because you know it's right, that's the right thing to do. And that's what the Corinthians had to do. We see that in 2 Corinthians 9. And as we come back to Philippians chapter 4, this is what they did as they kept giving to Paul, because they knew what Paul was doing was from God. And so Paul's saying, I desire that fruit may abound to your account at the judgment seat of Christ, which we just read from 1 Corinthians chapter 3. So with that, we'll stop there. And it's a little bit early, about maybe 10 minutes early, but we'll go ahead and open up to any kind of thoughts, questions, or anything regarding Philippians chapter 4 or any other chapter or verse. And we'll go from there.
I just looked up the word rejoice in Webster's 1828 because I think I find with myself, there's a lot of words I know, but I don't really know. You know, I hear them, I use them, but I'm not sure I'm using them properly. And so I was wondering what is meant by rejoice, because I think if you said to somebody on the street, rejoice, they're going to think you want to party, you're going to want to, you know what I'm saying, to dance and to sing and all that. We're singing, yes, you know, but it says here, to experience joy and gladness in high degree, to make joyful, to gladden, to animate with lively, pleasurable sensations, to exhilarate those who loveth wisdom, rejoice his father. So, you know, it's not party time, I guess, is what I'm trying to get at.
It depends on what you're rejoicing. Because in Philippians 4:4, the instruction that we're told is to rejoice in the Lord.
Right.
People can rejoice in different things. People can rejoice in the fact that McDonald's has a 2-for-1 sale or something.
Yeah. Well, that's what I'm saying. You know, it's not. I don't think most people would understand this kind of rejoicing on the street if you ask them for definitions and
well, they would be right. If they're going to rejoice, they're going to be exalted or be happy or party. That's a loose term, but if you tell them to rejoice in drugs and rock and roll,
yeah, they would do that too.
They're rejoicing. So the verb is correct, but I
meant the usage. You know, how we're using it here.
Well, because you have to say what to rejoice in. Because
Okay,
if you tell them to rejoice, they'll go and rejoice in heathen things.
Yeah, okay.
They'll go rejoice in unsaved things.
I see what you're saying.
So they'll rejoice, but they'll rejoice in what they want to rejoice in. So.
So you did this lesson in response to my whining at the beginning about having to go through all this stuff. So I should just be content no matter what my state, right?
Actually, that actually worked out with Philippians. With Philippians.
Yeah.
That's more for all of us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So Joe was saying, "Oh, I got something out of it," and I get something out of it. So that, it wasn't targeting anyone as much as teaching
Everybody.
Teaching everybody.
Yeah.
Well, I'm a target-rich environment, so whatever topic you bring up, it's going to apply.
Well, that's like 4-8. Like I said, that kind of helped me get through some of this turmoil the last couple of weeks when you think about these things as opposed to
Philippians 4:8, yeah.
4-8, yeah.
But the fasting is not applying to us.
Oh yeah, fasting, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, like what was it? Like I had to take Philippians 4:11 through 13 the other day when the temporary cap came off my tooth. I clocked in at 2 a.m. The cap came off at 3 a.m. Doctor's office doesn't open until 7 a.m. and nobody comes into work until 6 a.m. So I'm there by myself with the nerve coming out of my tooth, and I had I can either worry or I can just keep working and be content until the doctor's office opens. So I'm sitting at work with the nerve coming out of my tooth.
Yeah, it hurts.
And I was in pain for about 5 hours, but I had to be content. Or as Paul says, I had to learn in whatsoever state I am to be content. So I had to be content for about 5 hours. And,
Waiting for coworkers.
Waiting for coworkers to show up, waiting for
You're not grudge.
the doctor's office to open. And I just keep going.
Yeah, luckily they open up at 7.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Not many doctor's office open at
So
7.
that's when the doctrine hits you. When the issue happens, the doctrine kicks in, and you just
Yeah, it does
Go from
it makes a difference. It kind of grounds you or stabilizes you a little bit.
Yeah.
Helps you see the bigger picture.
Yep. So, yeah, I see Corey and David, Tia, more people showing up. So it's good to see everyone there.
Yes. Really? Tell them turn.
I'm here. I just got a lot of kids.
Where's the kids?
Joanne wants your kids. So, but yeah, if anyone's got any thoughts or questions or anything,
You know more, right?
yeah, I think Ryan took his social media and he just,
A lot of people are doing that.
yeah. So did Steve Yoak.
So did Ernie Cooper.
Yeah.
Is that holy water?
Yeah. Fresh from the Catholic
Font, baptismal font.
Baptismal font. Yep. So, but yeah. Let's see. Yeah, it's super early. But yeah, was it Ryan showed up last week about this time too? So. But yeah, the judgment seat of Christ always a good thing to go through. And we see how the Philippians are plugging in with Paul's information here. Paul's still in jail. Paul's like a multitasker. He's in jail and he's making everything happen. So
there's hope for you, Gene. Don't be afraid to get locked up.
3 hots and a cot.
yeah. So, but yeah, I don't know if anyone had any thoughts on Philippians or any questions in general. I know we were getting some good questions. I don't know if it's hard to bring it up, Nicholas, but we were talking earlier about Daniel chapter 7, lining up a little bit with Ephesians. Not literally, but we were looking at some of the terms, some of the verses. and brought up a good point about who might be the watchers. That was a question that was brought up. It's Daniel chapter 7. We'll just go through some questions, and if anyone has any other questions as we go through some questions. I believe it was actually Daniel chapter 4. Daniel chapter 4. Verse 13, I think it was. So we kind of, let me get there myself. Daniel 4:13. And let's see. There we go. And it says here that I saw in the visions of my head on my bed, and behold, a watcher and an holy one came down from heaven. And this was all about Nebuchadnezzar is the one writing all of this, and by the time you get to verse 13, you're seeing this about a watcher and a holy one, so on and so forth. And as we were kind of working, kind of crunching the numbers, so to speak, we were kind of saying that this would be these would be angels or an angel, but yet they take the angel and use it by their occupation, their verb, what they're doing, instead of saying here's an angel, here's another angel. They're saying it as a watcher. And then I said in Ephesians 3:10, as we teach, as the church teaches the principalities and powers, they're the ones that are watching.
You're watching what? I'm not.
Well, in Ephesians 3:10, it goes on to say, or we can start in verse 9. Ephesians 3:9 says, "And to make all men see what is the fellowship of the mystery, which from the beginning of the world hath been hidden God, who created all things." I'm sorry, did I get that right?
Yeah.
Hath been hidden God, who created all things by Jesus Christ, to the intent that now unto the principalities and powers in heavenly places might be known by the church the manifold wisdom of God. So we're seeing that in heavenly places, you got principalities and powers watching us, that they might know by us, by the church, things that are going on.
So that's what Daniel's talking about here. This watcher is somebody who's watching us.
Well, not in Daniel, but they are watching.
Well, who is this watcher in Daniel?
When Daniel was 4:13.
13, yeah.
He says, "I saw in the visions of my head upon my bed, and behold, a watcher and a holy one came down from heaven." You got a watcher. In this case, they're just using this term for what it looks like to be, at the very least, an angel, and the holy one came down from heaven. It says, "And cried aloud and said, hew down the tree and cut off his branches and shake off his leaves and scatter his fruit. Let the beasts get away from under it and the fowls from his branches." It goes more into this, but it's also talking about Nebuchadnezzar, because you see in verse 16, it says, "Let his heart be changed from man's, and let a beast's heart be given unto him, and 7 times pass over him." This is something that happens to Nebuchadnezzar, and this is something that I was just seeing from
Let his
here.
heart be changed from man's, let a beast's heart be given unto him, and let 7 times. This matter is by the decree of the watchers.
Yeah.
So what is you don't know what the decree of the watchers is, do you?
Well, it says this matter is by the matter is the one that is the heart of Nebuchadnezzar being changed from the. Remember you read the entire Bible. Remember Nebuchadnezzar goes out and eats grass. He's kind of loses his mind for a time.
Yeah.
Like in the heart of the beast.
This matter is by decree of the watchers. Is this the only time you hear anything about watchers? Is in Daniel?
Oh, you see it once in Jeremiah, because I looked that up as well.
Okay.
But
Okay.
even so, you see these. They're more, what the term more like diligent watchers, and you see things more that lead into the book of Enoch, and they go, or what's that book? Yeah, Book of Enoch. But you don't want to use the book of Enoch for anything. It's not a book of the Bible. But
Yeah.
they go way off. They start going way off into crazy things. But you don't want to use that book. That's just not the place to go. But for some reason, that Enoch book starts really jumping into
Watchers and stuff.
watchers and things. It's not the place to be. But it was a question. It was a question came up this week. It was a good
It's a
one.
good
A
question,
good
yeah.
question, yeah.
Yeah.
Because I never heard, I mean, I've read it, but the term watchers never really meant anything to me.
That's why we're all studying. That's why we're all jumping in and looking around. And, just checking out verses.
Sometimes you read over it and you either don't catch it or you're thinking,
Yeah,
you're looking at this part.
Yeah.
There's just so much there.
Yeah.
Well, like you said, certainly
I don't know.
Hmm?
Good question. So, yeah, what were you saying, Gene?
well, certainly like you said, the angels are going to be watching us.
Mhm.
The heavenlies are watching us to see, why would anybody follow God? That has not met him, seen him, known him like they have.
Yep. Yep.
You
And
know,
you've got the angels in the second heaven, and you got the angels in the third heaven. You got righteous angels, you got rebellious angels today, right now.
Yeah.
And then from 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 3, it says, "Know ye not that we shall judge angels?" So at some point when the body of Christ takes their place, we're judging righteous and rebellious angels, and we're based on what they know and what they believe and how they operate, what they did. We're going to judge them and say, you were a righteous angel, you were a rebellious angel. So we judge them. I don't know if we call them watchers. We could maybe,
Yeah.
say, we can tell them, hey, I read Daniel 7, I read Daniel 4:13. You're a watcher.
Don't call me a watcher.
Yeah.
I'm a doer.
Yeah, exactly. So, but there's a little more learning. So,
It's interesting.
but I don't know what I said. I think Gene, you're in Deuteronomy, was it, or Leviticus?
Leviticus. Yeah.
Leviticus, yeah. I got lots of good rules in there. That's good stuff. But those are cool. Those are good, interesting laws and rules. I mean, they're good stuff.
So you're practicing up on the law, Gene, or?
Sharpening my knives to sacrifice. Yeah.
Sabbath.
The scapegoat.
Mistake.
Well, remember the Sabbath. If no one kept the Sabbath, you had to kill the person
Yes.
who didn't keep the Sabbath.
Mhm.
That's why if you see any Seventh-day Adventist, you have to say, how many people have you killed for not keeping the Sabbath?
Especially if they're not.
Yeah.
If you get sent
I'd be afraid to say that to anybody.
today.
How many people you killed?
Mhm.
I wouldn't say that to a Seventh-day Adventist any more than I'd say it to a,
We might get an answer.
who, wouldn't want it.
Yeah. Yeah.
As long as he doesn't say what, including you.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, that's where we're at here. So yeah, think about now that we got more people from where we were this morning. Or where we were when we got started. Think about as we just wrapped up Philippians 4:17. We got about 8 more verses or something, or 6 more verses. Think about what book you want to pick up on after Philippians, because we're just wrapping it up. We'll have one more study, one more week, one more Wednesday, and then it's on to the next book. But what book should that be?
Well, the next book is Colossians.
Well, we can move it. We can move it into Colossians if that's something you want to go into. Could be Colossians, could be whatever.
I like Colossians.
Colossians. Well, I already got 2 votes for Colossians. And, I mean, I'll still wait another week, but sounds like we're going down the line. Unless
Because I read this.
Colossians ahead by 2.
You like that?
It's good. I read this yesterday.
Like the book of the
Colossians.
You like the book of the
Me too.
the book of the Filipinos?
Was that a third vote for Colossians?
Yeah.
Okay.
See?
Okay. All right, so maybe we'll just go right into Colossians after Philippians then. Yeah, could do that.
I want to recount.
Oh yeah.
I was gonna say, we could hold a vote in Atlanta and see how many votes we got.
I want a forensic audit.
Okay.
So, but yeah, so we got that, and that's pretty much where we're at with everything. We'll do this. We'll be back here on Sunday with Romans, and we'll probably wrap up Romans chapter 11 on Sunday. But I don't know if anyone's got any other thoughts or questions. I mean, it's good to see everyone here. Anyone's got anything while we're here? But if not, we can wrap up a little bit early.
Night.
See? So all right, we'll wrap up. We'll keep going. The chat room's open all the time. Whenever anyone's got any questions, we'll be glad to take them.
At that time.
And yeah, we'll address them and we'll answer them for you, and we'll keep going.
Pressing.
Yeah, keep pressing on, as Terry used to say. Keep pressing on.
Okay, well.
Thank you, everybody, for being here.